So this is a brief lecture on how to create your first program for Android. So we're going to do a simple Hello World program. We're going to be using the IDE Android Studio. So I'm already going to assume that you've installed it with the appropriate Android SDK that you wish to use. There's information on our website, but developer.android.com is where you go to get that. Both of those items. So once you launch your Hello World, once you launch Android Studio, the first thing that you're going to do is say File New Project, and it's going to pop up this sequence of interfaces that you're seeing here. The first one, you're going to specify the application name and the package which you represent like as a company domain, and then finally the location of where you want to do it. You'll notice that here it's putting it in the special directory called Android Studio Projects. And I really wouldn't change that unless you have something to do so. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to choose what type of device that you're targeting and the minimum SDK that you're targeting. So here you can see it's for a phone or a tablet, and it's the KitKat 4.4. Once you do that, you'll move on to the interface you're seeing in the lower right, which has a series of pre-coded interfaces that you can choose to start. For this simple Hello World, we're going to do a blank activity, but take a look at them, read about them at the Developer Android website. You can see there's some with tabs, there's some with like selectable lists and everything. Of course, the code they generate is more complex. You have to understand them. So we're going to just do a single activity interface that's represented by blank activity. The last interface you're seeing in the lower left here, you're going to give a name to your activity. Now this is actually a Java class that's going to be generated, and you should give it a meaningful name. I'm just going to call it main activity here. And the other thing is the title. The title will appear on the top in the title bar. And the other thing that you want to specify is a layout name and a menu name. Now, even though this is a blank activity, it has associated with it a layout and interface, as well as it has a menu option. And so these are files that will be generated for you. Initially, they'll be blank, and they're actually, interestingly enough, XML files. We're going to talk about that more a little bit later. But when you're done, just specifying the names of what these files will be, the name of the class, you're going to hit Finish. What will happen is it will generate a series of folders like you're seeing here in a project. So this is the project structure. And you can see there is the main app folder, and underneath it there's some directories or subfolders. Manifest is one, Java is one, RES is another. We'll talk about what each of these mean and in some detail now and more detail later. But one thing to notice is under manifest, there's a single file generated called Android manifest.xml. That's actually kind of like a ship's manifest. It's going to tell us what all the different components are. Remember, we talked about an Android application being a set of loosely coupled components. So it has to know what all of the different components are. You can have multiple activities and so on. And that's going to be listed in that special XML file. So the Java directory holds the actual source code. And if you notice here, the package it created, com example lin.hello-world-android, was the name that I had given it when I created my project. And main activity underneath there is a single Java file. That's the actual name of the class that I specified as my main, initially blank activity. The RES folder is called the resource folder, and it contains a number of very useful files. For example, it contains a file called layout, and that's actually where you can contain XML files specifying your layout. As we'll see a little bit later, you can actually specify your interface in code, in Java code, or actually in text files, which are XML files. XML stands for Extended Markup Language, Extensible, Markup Language, and it is a format used on the web a lot to basically format any kind of data that you might have. And in this case, it's to format how we describe our layouts. And we'll learn that XML later, so don't worry about it. But this is all very new to you. Those of you who have done some kind of GUI programming, it's been done completely in, let's say, Java code. In this case, we can actually separate the design of the interface in XML from the actual code. And we can also dynamically create things in code too. So you're not just stuck with one or the other. Another really interesting file is called Drawable. Drawable is where we have our icons, other kinds of images, things that we want to have in our interface. And we'll talk about it later, but we can have different resolutions. We have subfolders inside our Drawable that talks about that, so that it automatically will load the appropriate icon for the resolution of your device. Menu, we're not going to talk about now. This is just a very simple hello world, but you can, like your layout, specify menus in Java code, but you can also do it in XML. And if you were doing it in XML, it would be in the subdirectory here. Values is a directory that has, again, XML files, and these are general values that could be useful, but these files have specific names and they're used in specific ways, and we'll learn that as we go along, all of these things. But one, for example, is strings.xml. Anything that you might want to hard code, right, like a label or that you have on your interface, the names of button, the label on the buttons, anything like that, you could put in strings.xml. And rather than hard coding it in the actual Java code, we'll learn later how you can say, look in that strings.xml file and find in there this particular item. So it's a nice way of, again, kind of like the interface, things that are static, that aren't really changing, right? We can separate from code. Very useful. Down below, after all the app, you'll see there is a area called Gradle scripts. We're not going to really talk very much about this, but Gradle is a tool that lets you do compiling. If you've ever used Ant in Java, it has some similarities to that. We don't really need to edit or change any of these files. Android Studio automatically does that for us. So pretty much we're going to ignore everything in there, but I just want you to know what that is. You could edit it by hand. You really don't want to. So the manifest file I mentioned you is created for you automatically. It's like a ship's manifest. Like if you're going on a ship, they'll have a manifest, which is basically a long list of all the things that are on board, including passengers even. And here, we're kind of the same thing. Like, what is part of our app? We have activity 1, activity 2, and so on. And this is what is described inside this XML file. So again, it's initially created by Android Studio for you. Because we chose the blank activity, we know that, I've told you before, that corresponds to having a single activity application. We know that that name we gave it, main activity, if you remember before, here, main activity, you can see it there. It will actually be referenced inside the XML file. Other things that you're going to put inside the XML file, are you going to ask for permissions. So anytime you use any particular hardware feature of the device, we have to ask for permission, even to use the internet from the application. And we'll learn how to do that. We have a specific lecture just on manifest a little later, and we'll learn it as we go and try new and different things. So this is the beginning Hello World Android manifest.xml file. And you can see in here we have it's a language of tags. If you are familiar with HTML or have ever looked at HTML, this looks a bit like that. XML is a language of tags. In fact, XHTML, which is an XML compliant version of HTML, is an XML language. This is an Android manifest XML language. So here we can see the very first tag after we declare the version of XML we're using. It says less than manifest, and at the very bottom it says /manifest. That's what I mean by a pair of tags. So this is the start of my manifest, and at the very end of the file, that's the end, the /manifest, the end of my manifest. Inside there you see you have one application being declared. You see application here, and then /application. And inside that application you have a single activity, activity/activity. And inside that it has a single intent. Okay, the other thing you'll notice is there's a uses SDK, and that's the minimum version, the KitKat that we specified earlier. One other little thing pointed out here in terms of this intent is, I'm just going to tell you what it means. For the most part, we don't write this XML. We're going to use, whenever possible, a graphical means to edit it. Sometimes we will need to, and looking at examples like this, going to the Developer Android site are ways to help yourself, looking at the book too, to try to remember these tags. And the nice thing about the Android Studio is it'll help you try to autocomplete, kind of like Word, when you start typing in, or some of your text programs, when you start to type in a word, it makes suggestions. That's true also in Android Studio. So you kind of don't have to remember everything, but more recognize that this would be what you would want. In the intent filter, you notice it has, so take a look there, the intent filter tag. It has a sub tag there called category. And it says that it's a launcher. And there's a little arrow pointing to it. And it says that basically it means this activity is the first interface. It's the interface that when the application starts will be launched. Okay. So I mentioned to you before that the layout can be specified in XML, right? A separate XML file in the layout directory under the resource RES directory, or it can be done in code. So again, you have those two options, XML or Java code. So modern frameworks today like to separate interface design from the actual code. And that's the case here. So the interface design is done in XML. That's an option. It's a good option because we're separating it from the more dynamic code. Okay? It's not necessary, and there's times when you want to add, dynamically change an interface. You definitely have to do some things in Java, and we'll learn to do both. But as you start to work more and more, especially like on your project, you'll notice that you'll be using the XML more. And the nice thing about Android Studio, as we'll learn later, is it has a drag and drop feature for designing interfaces that generate the XML for you. So, the layout with XML. You're going to need an XML file, okay? Again, there's GUI ways to generate the contents inside, but the XML file will be contained inside the layout directory, which is inside the RES directory as shown here. When we created our blank project, it created this file automatically for us. If I kind of go back and I look here, I look in that very last interface right before I hit finish. I specified the name of the activity, but notice I specified also the layout name, which is activity_main. So that's where that file name came from, okay? And it's generated automatically. This is what it looks like when you choose to create a blank activity application project like we just did. It here has a linear layout, right? So you can see linear layout / linear layout. This is talking about how we control where our widgets go in our interface. We have a lecture and a series of web pages all about layout that you'll learn more about the details later. But for now, what it means is that we're going to have things appear, in this case vertically. If you notice in red it says vertical orientation in the XML. So the first widget will be on the top, then the next one, then the next one, then the next one in a vertical layout. So for phone, which is what we're targeting, that's not an uncommon, very simple layout. We don't have a lot of real estate on the phone, so sometimes just having that linear layout makes sense. We're going to learn much more complex layouts later on, but for a beginning hello world, that works for us. And for this automatically generated project, it actually puts a widget in there, one widget, and take a look at the XML and tell me what you think that widget is. It's actually text view, okay? And that is just simply like a label. And it has some attributes to it. It has a layout width that's going to fill the parent, so the width of the phone. But notice the height is going to be just enough to wrap the content. So you have like hello world, some string going in there. It doesn't want to take up the entire phone height. It's just enough to put the actual text there. Now, the actual text is specified with that third attribute. It says Android : text equals. Okay, so take a look at that. Android : text equals @string / hello. So that's interesting. What's going on there? It's actually going into your directory structure, okay? And it's looking inside the values directory for that strings.xml folder. So that, you can't change the name of that. That was auto-generated, but you can put new things in there. It will go to that strings.xml file and says @string, and it's looking for a special string called hello. And whatever is it'll say like hello equals hello world. It'll take that value, hello world, and put it as the contents of the text view. So a little bit about this vertical versus portrait or landscape is the other option. Horizontal is another word, vertical. So vertical and portrait are synonyms, and horizontal and landscape are synonyms. But we usually say vertical or horizontal when we're typing XML code. But when people are talking, like Android developers, they'll say portrait, vertical, kind of interchangeably, and similarly say horizontal and landscape interchangeably. So this is what they look like. Okay, so you see what vertical is up and down, and like this. Horizontal is like that. So you can specify just for this simple linear layout whether you want it to appear vertically or horizontally. Great. So later on we're going to talk about how interfaces rotate. We haven't really talked about that yet. I mean, this is hello world, right? So a little bit at a time we're going to do. Okay, so great. This is the text view. You can type it in manually, but we're going to learn later about drag and drop if you wanted to add something to there. Okay, so here's some screenshots kind of showing you how you could make a new layout XML folder. You just go to Android Studio, say new layout resource file. You select layout, and then you go ahead and, as we'll see right here, you can drag and drop. So the interface is shown there in black, and I've dragged a text and edit text area, and I've dragged a button. Okay, so it's just dragging and dropping, very easy, almost like you're painting. And this is what got generated here on the left for that particular. This is called main2.xml. So you can see we're not doing linear layout. We're using instead something called absolute layout. And again, we're going to talk about later what all these different layouts are, so don't get too worried about it. But inside the absolute and slash absolute, can you tell how many items we have? Well, you can see, right, there's 2. And you can see in the XML there's 2. The first one is the edit text, and the second one is the button. And as is the case with all the XML we've seen before, the edit text has a whole bunch of attributes. Like the text that it contains is /hello. It has a certain width. And again, we'll talk about layouts. It says 169 dp. For now, just think of that as pixels, but we'll talk about what dp and some of the other units mean later on. Has a height of 115. So that text box that you're seeing is a bit wider, almost 1.5 times wide as it is high. All right, and then we have a button, right? And it has, its own text on there. And in this case, we hard-coded it. We hard-coded it to the value button, actually, rather than going to the strings folder and getting a value. It's not really great to hard-code like that. Better to put it in strings, but, it's possible to do it a lot of different ways. We'll talk about some of these other attributes that I'm skipping over, like ID, a little bit later. That's a very important and should be unique for every widget, the ID, because that ID is what we use in our code to grab a handle to the layout item specified in XML. And that's something we need to do later when we do event handling. But we will learn about event handling, not just making dummy interfaces a little later. But for this class, this project that we're doing right now is Hello World, so it's pretty easy. So remember when we generated our project, we had to give the name of our activity class, right? So the main activity class. And we know that we specified the name of an XML file, and we saw that it made a little text in there with the hello string, which is kind of what we want. But what about the code that actually gets generated? So let's take a look at that. So this is the kind of code that gets generated. In fact, let me skip over a couple. This is actually what it looks like more. So if I called it main activity, it would have been, instead of hello Android, it would be called main activity extends activity. Has a single method here called onCreate that's written for you. Now, do you remember in our introduction to Android the idea that activities have life cycles, and that the very first thing they do is they're created, and that the Android system calls a special method called onCreate? Right here it is. And what we're doing in here is we're generating the interface from XML. How do we do that? This method here called setContentView, we pass it the name here of the XML file that we want to load. Now notice before that I say r.layout. Remember, our XML layout files are inside the layout directory, so that's where that layout comes. R is a special reference to say that we're actually looking inside our project structure. I'll talk about what R means in a little bit. But this code here is the code that would simply bring up an activity in onCreate, and it would take and expand. That's the phrase that we use. Basically, it would take all the XML specifications, like the linear layout and the single text view, and it would create those objects and draw the interface for you. Okay? One line of code. That's pretty great. Okay, let's go back to where we actually started here. And we're going to look a little bit about how we can actually now not just use an XML file to create our interface. What if we really wanted to do it in code? This is how you would do it, okay? So Again, mostly you're going to be creating your interfaces with XML files. Occasionally you're going to need to do things dynamically. So it's good to see both. In this case, again, we have our activity. It's called Hello World. And it has our special onCreate method. And again, that's the method that will be called the first time the activity is created. So we're going to set up our interface. First thing, boom. And what we're going to do is the first line of code, super.onCreate. Basically what that's going to do is if there was a saved instance state, it'll bring it back. So we're going to always leave that line of code there. And then the next 3 lines, what we're doing is we're creating an instance of a text view. Right? That's just a text like a label. And that is a class that's part of Android. If we go to the developer website, android.developer.com, we would see that there. And basically, it is a descendant of the view class, just to represent like a text, like a label. So, text view, TV equals new text view. Okay? This. Now, if we look up the text view class inside of our Java API, what we're going to notice is that the constructor for it needs to take the context in, who kind of owns this text view, and it's this activity. So this is referring to the activity itself. Remember, that is a special keyword in Java that means me, myself, my class. And this method is inside the Hello World activity, so that's who we're referring to. So great, we created a text view, but we didn't specify the actual text yet that's going to belong inside it, right? So that's what the second line there in right underneath says. It says TV dot set text. Hello, Android Lynn. So basically, this method, setText, is a setter method. If you remember that concept from object-oriented programming, setter methods are methods that usually start with the word set, and they set some particular variable. In this case, for the text view class, the value of the actual text. So tv.setText, and we pass a string, which is what will appear. Now that's great. We created an instance of text view, but we haven't said that that should go inside the activity, okay? So this is a really, really simple interface. It has only a text view in it. We haven't even specified a layout. We haven't done anything else here. So we're just saying set the content view equal to that text view object we created. And so this would create a simple interface similar to what the XML interface looked like that has a single text view. All right, so what have you learned? Okay, you created an activity called Hello World. It extends activity, that's what makes it that. Your application has a context, and that's important when we are creating views. They need that in the constructor, who's the owner. And a view is a GUI element. There's different kinds like the text view that we're using. And the constructor here needs that context, which in this case is the activity. So if you recall before when we were doing the XML file, I'm going to jump back to it. We said r.layout.main to specify the XML file. Well, we know the main.xml file is inside layout directory. So that kind of makes sense, right? But what's this R business? Okay, let's back up. So what R is it's actually a file, and it's automatically created for you by Android Studio, and it's called r.java. It's actually a Java file. And what that is it basically, it's somewhat like a manifest file, but in Java. It points to the different resources in your project. So for example, actually let me see if we have an example in here. Actually we don't. That's such too bad. We have an example on the website that I'll let you take a look at. But it'll actually point to the strings, it'll point to the different layouts, it'll point to all of these things. So when we say r.layout, it knows where in memory that layout folder is. So that's very interesting. Sometimes this automatically generated file gets, for lack of a better technical word, messed up. It's not synchronized with what the project structure looks like. I don't know why these bugs happen, but the fix to it is to do a clean of the project. And if you go to, as mentioned here in red, the build menu in Android Studio and you say clean project, it'll regenerate for you this r.java file. An interesting thing to note is that this idea of cleaning a project is not just in Android Studio. A lot of IDEs like Eclipse, for example, and NetBeans, they all have this concept. I'll tell you, it does really sometimes make me wonder why they have this tool to regenerate something that should really be maintained correctly in the first place. But what I will say is these IDEs like Eclipse and Android Studio that are modern today, they actually are not a single program, and they actually launch other programs. Remember we talked about with Android Studio, we got a series of developer tools like the SDK manager, there's an APK packager, there's a debug monitor. All of these things are actually separate processes that get launched. They communicate to each other. And I believe in this kind of complexity that sometimes the data gets unsynchronized in the timing of things. And so rather than requiring the absolute synchronicity of this, they allow for occasionally these errors coming up and you having to do a project clean. So very, very important to remember why I have it in red. It's also on our website. It's under one of the tips. If you have problems, all of a sudden if your project can't find some layout file, it's complaining about the R file, that's what you want to do. Number one is to clean it. Great. Okay, so we talked about XML. This is just talking a little more again about that every tag, in this case the text view tag, will have a series of attributes. And it's just showing you again, reiterating what each of those things means. So if you want to pause the video and take a look at this and read through it, that's great. And every widget, whether it's a text view versus let's say a button, some of the attributes they will have in common, like width and height, because anything that you visually see will have a width and height generally associated with it. But some things won't, like for example an image view. There's no text associated with an image, right? But there is with the text view and with a button, the text that appears on it. So the attributes are going to be different for every widget. They'll be unique. Some in common, but some specific. So here's the resource directory again. Just a reiteration of what layout, here's strings, the drawable. Now I mentioned I would tell you a little bit about the fact that, as you can see here, we have more than one drawable folder. We have a drawable, which is the default folder. We have something here, drawable HDPI, MDPI, X, HDPI, XX, HDPI, and so on. So what that is referring to is different resolutions that your device might be running at. So the definition of what that means in terms of pixel resolution is actually something that changes, because as we get devices, as new devices come on, they have more and more pixels in general. So this is a changing definition. And you really have to go to the Android developer website to see what the current definition is. But obviously, MDPI is going to be smaller resolution than H for high, M for medium, and extra high and extra extra high are obviously going to be going up and up in resolution. And the idea is that you would want to, here I have, for example, a icon here called IC Launcher, which is my little icon that you see on the actual screen that represents the app that you click on as a user. I want to have different resolutions of it because you don't want to have a really small resolution on a big tablet. It's going to look terrible. So having these different images in there, and then what happens is the Android system actually knows what resolution it fits in. Does it fit? Is it actually the device an MDPI or is it an XXHDPI? And it will load the appropriate images from that folder. Now, if you decide for whatever reason not to do that, you're creating a beginning app, or you're doing exercises, for example, for this class, and you don't want to have all these different icons and worry about getting different, actually making different resolution images. Just, you can stick it all in Drawable. What happens is it'll look for it in the appropriate folder. If it can't find it, then it goes down to the next resolution, and then finally it'll go to Drawable as a default. So you could just put everything in Drawable for our exercises. We don't need to worry about it. Okay, event handling. We'll be talking about that later. Like, what if I put a button there? I want to press it. I want something to happen, right? So we'll be talking about how to do that in a later lecture. Again, views, lots of different views. We've seen a text view, we've seen an edit text, and we've seen a button so far in the previous slides, but there's many more, okay? Again, the place that you look for all of those is on the developer website. Certainly there's examples on my website, as well as there's examples in the book, but the developer API is what's inclusive of what you actually have in standard Android. So we are going to have a whole entire lecture on event handling, but just to kind of round out, if I made an app, if I had a button, what are the steps and stages involved? You're going to decide what you want to do. You're going to write code to it. We're going to learn what that is. So let's just pay attention to steps 1, 2, and 3 here. And then we go through a process of saying, when this button is hit, run this code, which is called registration of the listener. And again, we're going to go through all of that. Step 1, step 2, step 3. So I'm going to skip over this event handling. We'll come back to that. How do you run your code? Well, there's two ways for us, is we can run it on the emulator, and that's fine for our simple exercises, although depending on your computer, it can be slow. And if you have a really old computer or a not very good computer in terms of CPU and memory, it can be very slow. So sometimes running it on a device is much nicer. We have a video off of our website, as well as we have instructions on how to do it that you can, and then we're going to refer to that. So this is just showing you running it in the emulator. So you just say run and run app or debug app, depending on which you want to do, and it will launch the AVD, Android Virtual Device Manager, so that you can choose an emulator. Now, that means you've at least specified one emulator that fits in the APIs that you're trying to run. If you haven't, nothing will appear there and you won't be able to run it. We have some websites, some web pages on our class website that talks about how to set up an AVD step by step. But if you have an AVD, let's say this is again for, let's say, KitKat. If you have an AVD that's KitKat, then this can run. It'll be in the list. You can choose it and it will run. Okay, one tip, because the emulator is slow. It's actually a real emulator. What do I mean by that? There is something called an emulator and there's something called a simulator, and they're different. An emulator actually tries to function exactly the way the Android device would. You can even specify what the network speed would be. All of these things are things you can do when you set up your AVD. However, in the case of a simulator, that's not true. You actually just run it and see what it looks like, but it's not trying to mimic in any way the performance. Why is it like this? Fucking game. So this is part of why it can take a relatively long time to run code. So a few tips. First of all, we have a web page that has tips about emulators. So take a look at it. I update and give new ideas there. Things change with technology. The first thing is don't kill the emulator. If you're writing code, testing, write, test, write, run, right? As you should. Don't kill the emulator each time, because if you just run it again, it'll just transfer the APK file, and you won't have all that load time to bring up the emulator in the first place. So that's number one tip. Of course, sometimes the emulator crashes, right? And it might not even be because of your code. And then, of course, you'll have to rerun it. There is something called Intel virtualization. I will let you look at do a Google on it. But you can set up your machine, if it has Intel virtualization on your chipset, your Intel chipset on your computer, it can emulate faster. That's what the virtualization is. And that's actually independent of just Android Studio. Virtualization is a concept with other IDEs because they have emulators. And so Intel has this processing component to help with it.